This episode of Historsea is brought to you by John Hansen and Albin Vergara, this week's news patrons. So, you want to build a canal. You've got state approval. You have a very small and restrictive budget that they've given you. You have a ragtag group of inexperienced people who want to help. You've got horses and black powder, but you have some problems. 360 miles of problems over the harshest terrain imaginable through the Appalachian Mountains, some 600 feet high. You have forests of trees that are hundreds of years rooted into the hard ground, the solid limestone of the Niagara Escarpment, and the malaria-riddled swampland in the middle. This week on Historsea, the second episode of our special on how the Erie Canal changed America. Last week we talked about how the Erie Canal came to be, the bustling young American East Coast, and why it was so critical that America find a reliable way to ship goods and people between the rich and fertile lands to the west and the cities popping up to the east. Despite all the obstacles in the way, Mayor DeWitt Clinton was hell-bent on getting a canal built, and now that he had the approval of New York State and a little $7 million budget, it was time to get cracking. Because DeWitt couldn't afford all the expert canal builders from Europe to come over and lend him a hand, he hired a bunch of inexperienced people that he could afford. James Geddes and Benjamin Wright, they laid out the route that the canal would take. They were judges, and their background was dealing with land disputes and things like that. But they laid out the path, and they even showed where that locks were going to be. Geddes had only used surveying equipment for a few hours before he set out to make that plan. They also hired Nathan Roberts, who was a math teacher, but he would actually be critical later. This image of the original canal plans really highlight the problems that they faced. On the left of the picture, we have the west end of the plan at Lake Erie, and on the right, the east end of the plan at the Hudson River at sea level, some 565 feet lower. Now, the decision was made to start with the easiest part while they were learning to actually build a canal, because after all, none of them had. Right smack dab in the middle is where they would start at Rome, New York. Before the Erie Canal, Rome was a small village located on the banks of the Mohawk River in what was then known as the western frontier of New York. This was as west as it got. The village was originally called Fort Stanwix, and it was established in 1758 as nothing more than a military outpost during the French and Indian War. During the American Revolution, Fort Stanwix, or now Rome as we call it, played a crucial role in the defense of the frontier, and it was the site of a significant victory for the Continental Army in 1777 when it successfully defended the port against a British siege. After the Revolution, Rome continued to grow as a center of commerce and trade. It was located on the main transportation route between Albany and Buffalo, when that main transportation route was nothing more than a horse path, and it became an important stopping point for traders and settlers and travelers headed westward. The plan was to start in Rome with a flat section headed east toward Utica. All they had to do was dig a 4-foot deep trench that was 40 feet wide. But that proved to be a lot more difficult because of the trees. They couldn't just cut down all the trees. They had to remove the stumps too, so that they could dig the ditch. But all they had at the time were axes. And while that does work to cut down trees, it would take decades to deal with the thousands and thousands of trees that they needed to get out of the way. The math teacher Nathan Roberts had a solution. They made what they called a stump puller that they could power with animals. It was 2 huge wheels mounted loosely to the ends of an axle to hold it up off the ground. And then a third wheel, a bit smaller, was in the middle, and it was fixed to the axle. And then a chain was wrapped around the axle and hooked to the tree stump. A rope was wrapped around that center smaller wheel and hooked to an animal, usually an oxen. The mechanical advantage or torque obtained by this ripped the stumps out of the soil easily. This made them go from pulling 4 trees a day to 40 trees a day. And look at the design. The animal, the oxen, pulls the rope and it spins a giant center wheel, which through sort of gear reduction spins the axle with a huge amount of torque. And the axle pulls up on the stump with another rope or a chain with massive amount of lifting force. This is really cool. Once the trees were out of the way, they used something called a slip scraper to plow the earth. It works just like a plow or a bulldozer does today, but it's dragged with a horse, and it makes much faster work of the land than men with shovels. Slowly the team moved forward a few feet a day digging the ditch, but it took 2 long years for the first run to be made and end up in Utica, which was just 15 miles away. At this rate, it would take 30 years to finish the canal, but they were getting better at it, and help was just around the corner. Enter the Irish. Irish immigration to New York City was a significant demographic and cultural shift that began in the early 19th century and it continued through the 20th century. The Irish first came to New York in large numbers during the 1840s following the Great Famine in Ireland, which led to widespread starvation, disease, and death. Between 1841 and 1851, the Irish population in New York City more than doubled, from 33,000 to over 80,000. Many of the Irish immigrants settled in the city's poorest neighborhoods, like 5 Points, which was notorious for its overcrowding, its poverty, and crime. The Irish were often discriminated against too, and they faced significant challenges in finding employment. Despite these obstacles, the Irish community in New York flourished, and they went on to make significant contributions to the city's cultural, economic, and political life. Irish immigrants played a crucial role in the construction of a lot of the city's infrastructure, like the Brooklyn Bridge, and of course, the Erie Canal. The Irish welcomed the employment even though they didn't have it easy. They were immigrants to America and often treated horribly, ridiculed, and even attacked in the streets. And they lived in that poverty, but they were willing to take just about any job, even though they were paid less than an American worker. Some 5,000 Irish workers arrived at once, and Clinton was quick to hire them. The work on the Erie Canal was physically demanding and often dangerous, and many workers died due to accidents or illness and really harsh working conditions. Many Irish workers were employed as laborers digging out the canal with nothing but shovels and pickaxes, carrying heavy loads of dirt or rock, and operating cranes and other machinery. In all, every day saw some 3,000 men and 700 horses working on the canal as they reached Utica. But that was the end of the easy part. They'd completed the tree-falling, ditch-digging flatlands, and what laid next would be horrible. When the canal reached the Montezuma Marsh at the outlet of Cayuga Lake, just west of Syracuse, it was rumored that over 1,000 workers had died of what they called swamp fever. We know it today to be malaria. The construction was completely halted. However, instead of continuing to try to work in the swamp, they just moved forward to the downhill section toward the Hudson. And then the crews came back and worked the swamp when it froze in the winter, and all the mosquitoes had died off. As they dug the ditch, the walls of it were reinforced by yet more immigrants to young America. This time, it was the Germans. Like the Irish, the Germans had flocked to America in search of work and prosperity, and the German immigrants were employed in a variety of jobs on the canal project. Many of them brought skills with them from home in engineering and masonry, and they worked as skilled craftsmen and engineers, helping to design and build the locks and the aqueducts and the other structures that made the canal possible. The next challenge that the team would face would be the massive locks. How do you move ships up 600 feet into the mountains? Before we get there, I'm Tim from Historsea. Historsea is a brand new channel, and last week I was astounded with all the positive feedback you guys left in the comments. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. If you like history, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It's free for you, and it would really mean the world to me. With the flat part of the Erie Canal pretty well finished. The next phase was to get started on building the monumental locks. And locks are just used to move a ship up and down, and at the time, the best they could do with their locks was about 12 feet of elevation. This is why the original plans for the Erie Canal called for some 83 locks in all. The fundamentals of locks are pretty simple. As a ship approaches on the high side from, say, Utica, and it needs to come down, it stops at the lock gate. A valve underneath opens and allows the higher water to fill the lock chamber. Once it's full, the lock door opens and the ship pulls in, and then the door closes behind it. Then a valve on the lower end opens and drains the water out of the lock chamber and drains it downstream of the lock. Once the water level is level with the lower section, a door opens and the ship is free to carry on. When the ship wants to go up a lock, it all just happens in reverse. The lock chamber is empty and level with the low side, and the ship pulls in. With the door closed, a valve is opened on the high side and the chamber fills. Once full, the high side door opens and the ship continues on. I learned a couple cool things on top of that when I made my trips through the Erie Canal on my sailboat. Every time a ship uses the lock, a lock full of water is sort of stolen from the high side and deposited on the low side. Slowly, whatever body of water is feeding the high side, in upstate New York in this case, it's drained, and gradually, over all the locks, the water is eventually deposited in the Hudson River, one lock at a time, over and over and over again. And I talked to the lockmasters on my journey about this, and they sort of explained how it works. They keep a very close eye on the water levels on the high side and only operate the locks when there's a safe water level upstream. Now, originally the water up in the mountains ran downhill anyway, so the locks just speed up the process a little bit. In some locks now, pumps are used to bring the water back up to reservoirs, so the water is sort of equal on the high side and the low side. Nothing is wasted, which gets around that problem. Because of all of this, the locks now operate on the Erie Canal at a very strict and set schedule. When traversing the canal now, at the end of each day, you'll arrive at a lock that's closed for the evening. You dock in the town right before the lock, typically, then you head into town for dinner and touring of the historic scenery. In the morning, you wake up, and while you're getting the boat ready for the strict time that the lock opens, you hail the lockmaster on the radio. What I found interesting was that the lockmaster would always have the lock half full first thing in the morning. They would reply to my hail on the radio, and they would ask me to wait while I either filled the lock or emptied it based on which way I was going. And there's a good reason for this. Last week we talked about how lock doors are often designed to come to a point so that the water pressure in the chamber holds the doors shut, and then the doors push the force onto the lock walls. So at night, when they fill the lock halfway, puts pressure on both sides, both doors, holding them all shut all night. So no mechanical help is needed while the lock's in its shutdown condition. Historsea is brought to you by patrons, people who donate to the channel to make these videos possible. I sure couldn't do it without you. If you get some value from these videos and you want to help out, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos and live streams, and they take a big part in the discussion on what videos we're going to release in the future. The rest of the way to the Hudson from Utica was more of the same. They would continue to dig their 4-foot deep, 40-foot wide ditch, and when they needed to, they would build a lock. But headed east toward the Great Lakes, they ran into yet another huge problem. In many places along the plan, the Erie Canal comes to steep valleys and rivers, and the team had to find a way to get over them. So they turned to more European design philosophies, and they built aqueducts. An aqueduct is a structure designed to carry water from one location to another in its most rudimentary form. Aqueducts have been used for thousands of years to transport water for irrigation and drinking and other uses. In the context of the Erie Canal, aqueducts were used to carry the canal over rivers or other bodies of water. These structures were typically constructed of stone or brick and featured a series of arches or supports that held up a trough or a channel that carried the water. One of the most famous aqueducts on the Erie Canal is the old Erie Canal Aqueduct in Little Falls. This aqueduct spans the Mohawk River. It was completed in 1825, which is monumental to be completed back then before the advent of major industrial tools. It's made of local limestone and it features 3 arches to support a water trough that's 18 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Even before they did the original survey of the Erie Canal, the early builders knew that one of their biggest challenges would be how to carry the canal over the turbulent Genesee River in Rochester. There wasn't a single person in the new nation that had any experience with this kind of construction. The trip over the Genesee would need an aqueduct built, some 800 feet long, and they needed someone to actually do the immense job. And after some deliberation, the canal engineers hired William Britton. His credentials included the job he did where he erected these formidable 20-foot-high stone walls for the state prison in Auburn. Not only did Mr. Britton accept the position, but he was also instrumental in obtaining 30 convicts from that prison to assist with the labor. Britton paid no wages to these guys, and he kept them tethered to a ball and chain. And as we might expect, the free labor spent about as much time trying to escape as they did cutting into the limestone blocks. 7 of the discontented laborers, probably the 7 best swimmers, actually did escape to freedom while they were working on the project. In all, the Rochester Aqueduct was 11 stone arches created to support the massive aqueduct, and it was in constant need of repair due to the flooding and the raging river under it, and then, of course, the water freezing in the winter that expands and damages the structure itself. In the winter months, the water in the aqueduct, once frozen, would be used as the town ice skating rink for Rochester residents. In 1826, a woman named Anne Royal saw the massive structure for the first time, and she said, "We are lost in wonder to see boats and horses with men on them passing at such a vast height above the surface of a bold river. The aqueduct is built on arches of hewn stone, and for beauty, symmetry, and proportion is unrivaled." The first iteration of the Erie Canal had a series of these aqueducts that acted as sort of water bridges over those valleys and rivers below. And they had moved the trees and dug the ditches and built all the locks and now conquered the massive aqueducts that they needed. You could now take a ship physically from the Atlantic Ocean in the New York Harbor and head north up the Hudson. And then you could begin the Erie Canal and slowly but surely make your way up over 500 and some odd feet into the Appalachian Mountains and cross them some 300 miles inland with nothing more than a rope and a donkey. Most of the canal was finished, but for one problem, the biggest problem they would ever face. At the eastern end of the plan lay the mighty limestone Niagara Escarpment. This is an 80-foot tall, near impenetrable wall of limestone that they needed to get the canal to the top of. The feat was monumental, an 80-foot rise all at once. And with all that they had accomplished thus far, they could only do about 12 feet at a time. But Nathan, the math teacher, had another idea. They would just build sets of locks, all connected together, a staircase of locks, so to speak, locks that fed directly into each other, so the ships would just go from one lock to the next lock, interconnected, using the same water in each lock. It was efficient. It was brilliant even, but it means they needed to cut a trench into solid limestone and blast the locks out. All they had at the time was black powder. Remember, dynamite didn't exist yet, and blasting limestone was extremely dangerous. A lot of people died in this process. The mixtures and amounts had to be perfect. But the Irish came through again, and they got the job done. There are stories of too much powder being used, and blasts were so big that they knocked huge chunks of stone onto nearby houses. There's also stories of the Irish using fire to superheat the limestone and then pouring cold water on it and getting it to crack so they could move it more easily. In all, 2 staircases of locks were carved into the escarpment of limestone. Each staircase had 5 locks, and in total would raise a ship the last 90 feet that they needed to go up to reach the level of Lake Erie. But this led to yet another problem. The massive amount of water that they need to make all these locks work, all together, all at the same time. There's 10 of them in total, and remember we talked about how much water is moved downstream by one lock. Now there's 10. They needed limitless supplies of water to feed these things. The solution seemed obvious. Lake Erie was a never-ending source of water from the Great Lakes. But to get there, they would have to dig the canal from Lake Erie to Lockport, where the locks were, through bedrock and limestone. And there was a little bit of a competition that started to help. At the time, there were two towns on the Lake Erie side, Buffalo and Black Rock, and both of them wanted the canal to end in their own backyards. After all, whichever town houses the Erie Canal is going to grow at staggering speed. And as we know it today, Buffalo won that race, and it became a massive major city in upper New York. And they won because they dug their own rivers deeper, pre-existing rivers that were already there, deeper and wider, and they made their way up to where the engineers needed the water to make these locks work. In all, the staircase locks were blasted into the escarpment, and a trench was dug all the way to Lake Erie to make 90 feet of locks operate with the amount of water that they needed. And nearing the end of production on the Erie Canal, a lot of Irish workers ended up settling in the area, particularly in Lockport, right at the beginning of the canal. In 1825, the team of DeWitt Clinton and his ragtag bunch of inexperienced math teachers and litigators had done it. What the world called impossible, and Jefferson called little short of madness. They had connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, 363 miles and more than 80 locks some 600 feet up. They had finished the Erie Canal. Clinton arranged a grand victory celebration. He has some cool ideas. He's always the showman. First came the cannons. As the War of 1812 had pretty much just happened 10 years earlier, all these little towns in upstate New York still had cannons. So he arranged, through a lot of legwork, that a cannon would be fired in every town, starting in Buffalo, where the first cannon would sound, all the way to the last cannon in New York City. The cannon fire took an hour and a half to go from Buffalo all the way to the ocean, and there could be no mistake now. The Erie Canal was done. It was open for business. The next thing Clinton did was what he called the wetting of the waters. Clinton boarded a boat in Buffalo, New York, with a container of water that he scooped out of Lake Erie. Through great fanfare in every town, he traversed the whole canal on this boat, pulled by horses and donkeys along the way. And he did every single lock, all the aqueducts, and every painstaking mile of ditch that they had dug. He came out of the canal in New York, and he poured the lake water into the ocean. The trip took 10 days in total, the same amount of time that it takes today. It had only taken 8 years to complete the whole Erie Canal, locks and all, but the impact it had on America would last for decades, and the way it allowed America to grow would change the country forever. You have to remember that at the time it cost $100 to ship 1 ton of goods from Buffalo to New York or vice versa. On the canal, it wasn't $100, it was $10 for the same ton of goods. A donkey by itself could carry about 250 pounds down the road, but the same donkey could walk along the towpaths of the canal towing a barge weighing 60,000 pounds. And because they opened the canal in little sections as they finished them, the canal had already started to make money. In all, the total cost of the canal was $1.7 million at the time, but it recouped its whole construction cost in just 9 years, making it one of the most successful commercial projects the world had ever seen. Within 15 years of the canal's completion, the New York harbor grew to be the busiest in the country, moving more goods than Boston, Baltimore, and New Orleans combined. And almost every major city in New York is located on the Erie Canal. When you look at a map, it's staggering. At first, grain was the major commodity that was being moved from the fertile lands in the west to the east coast. But grain was very high volume and low price. It wasn't entirely efficient, so farmers quickly figured out that if you turn the grain into whiskey, you could make a lot more money. Whiskey was fairly expensive in comparison, and you could pack it in wooden crates and load a lot more of it on the barge. But this wasn't the only use for the canal. A culture formed of people living on boats on the canal. Typically a family. The father would be the captain, the wife would do the cooking for everybody, and the kids or hired crew would walk the donkeys down the towpath as they pulled the boat. They would travel from town to town, working and moving goods to make a living. The rich would also flock to the canal. Canal culture exploded with casinos and gambling, as well as entertainment and a huge nightlife scene. All of the well-to-do Americans had to have a taste of the Erie Canal. The little towns on the canal flourished, and a canal that was just supposed to haul grain quickly turned into a major tourist destination. New York City exploded with cheap timber and grain and food just pouring in from the Great Lakes region, and a whole new market opened up to ship manufactured goods back to the West. Massive shipping companies were founded, importing goods from all over the world and moving them from New York to anywhere that you wanted to on the Great Lakes. Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, Chicago, massive cities could now spring up all over the Midwest and the Ohio River Valley. America had been changed forever. Buffalo, being at the end of the canal, exploded too, from having just 200 residents in 1820 to more than 18,000 when they finished the canal. But Buffalo wasn't the only beneficiary of all this canal building. They built more canals with their newfound canal building know-how, and they connected more of the area. The Champlain Canal ran 60 miles, and it connected the system to Lake Champlain for goods to move to the north, to Upper Canada, now Ottawa and Montreal. The Oswego Canal ran 23 miles, and it cut north, but off the Erie Canal, so that it could connect to Lake Ontario, now Toronto, bringing Canadian grain down into the U.S. much more easily. The Cayuga-Seneca Canal ran some 20 miles due south to the Finger Lakes, Cayuga and Seneca, deeper into upstate New York to cities like Waterloo and Seneca Falls. The economy of the Erie Canal was staggering, and not just from the shipping jobs it created, but the massive maintenance it required, not to mention the tourism, and people flocked to it in droves, and quickly, Clinton's 40-foot wide, 4-foot deep ditch was simply not big enough anymore. Even before the end of the first full navigation season of the new Erie Canal, it was obvious that there was a need for enlargement. The wait for locks was taking hours, and the size of the boats that would fit were really restricted. The first enlargement began in 1836, rerouting parts of the canal and widening it to 70 feet instead of 40, and deepening it from 4 feet to 7 feet. Locks were doubled, too, to allow simultaneous two-way traffic, and they extended in length to accommodate larger boats. The canal has been enlarged again and again over the years, and much of the original canal no longer exists. By the early 20th century, the original Erie Canal, which went through the center of Rochester, proved to be too narrow and too shallow for commercial service. It was closed, dewatered, and transformed into a subway. Commercial traffic was diverted south around the city on the barge canal to cross the Genesee River, which the ships could do now because they were motorized. In the original canal, they had avoided existing lakes and shallow bodies of water, but now, with dredging and other technologies, the new canal could make use of the already existing water bodies, and it could adapt them for its shipping to pass through safely, and the canal takes a totally different route than it used to because of that. One such lake is Lake Oneida, which I have a lot of personal experience with. It's the only place on the canal where boats really have to deal with the weather or waves. The rest of it's very protected. Because the canal is littered with lift bridges in the towns for the roads to pass over the canal, boats cannot be taller than 14 feet. So in cases like mine, sailboats have to take their mast down and sort of strap it to the deck. Lake Oneida runs from west to east, and it's very long, so the predominant wind from the west can really kick up the waves, and having a 400-pound sailboat mast strapped high up on the deck can prove very uncomfortable and almost dangerous if it's not secured properly. The Erie Canal enjoyed over 100 years of busy prosperity and finally fell into disuse with the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959, which allows much larger freighters to sail from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, hauling significantly more goods much more efficiently. But while the heyday of the iconic small-town America surrounding the canal may be a thing of the past, the canal lives on as a tourist attraction where people kayak and paddleboard and even rent boats. They'll rent you a boat that you can sort of live on for a few days while you traverse a section of the canal, just like Clinton did so many years ago. The canal remains open today. It still goes from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, and you can show up on your own boat on a pleasure craft, and you can do the entire canal. It takes about 10 days, and there's 35 locks. The Erie Canal is an essential part of maritime history, and for those interested, I strongly suggest a visit to what is one of the most beautiful and historic maritime experiences that you can still have. If you like history, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Also, leave a comment below on what you would like to see in future episodes. If you want to help out and get early access to episodes, consider becoming a patron. This has been another Historsea video. I will see you next week.